Okay, we're gonna start and then we're gonna have other people joining in the next couple of minutes. Welcome everyone again. This is the NASA Carbon Monitoring System, CMS Policy Speaker Series, and the talk for April. Today we're gonna have, and we're honored to have Dominic De La Sala, Chief Scientist at World Heritage. He's gonna be talking about Old Growth Forest, the Old Growth Forest Mapping Initiative, and protecting mature and old growth forests as natural climate solutions. Before going to the talk today, I just want to mention a couple of things about the Carbon Monitoring System Initiative. For those of you that you don't know about this CMS initiative, let me just let me go back. So the carbon monitoring system, if you want to know more, just quickly, you can go to our new website, carbon.nasa.gov. It has been revamped, this website. It is more user-friendly. You can find information about the initiative, about all of the projects that are funded, the data products, papers, and very importantly, you can find information about stakeholders that we have engaged and some of these success stories, see how stakeholders are working with the CMS projects, and how they're using the data to inform their decision making. A couple of examples here that you can see with EPA, with the Maryland DNR, and with Rocky Mountain Institute, just some of the organizations that are using the CMS data products. In the website, carbon.nasa.gov, you can also find and download the CMS Phase 2 synthesis report and learn more about the scope, the findings, the gaps, and the recommended next steps in the initiative. Also, for those of you that are planning to submit a paper, please consider this a special session on carbon monitoring system research and applications in environmental research letters. You can also find more information in the website. And then finally, I just wanted to mention this upcoming workshop because it's very relevant to this topic. This is a U.S. Forest Service NASA Joint Applications Workshop. It's going to be happening in just 1-2 weeks in Salt Lake City. This is part of an Applied Earth Observations Innovation Partnership between U.S. Forest Service and NASA that started 4 years ago, also in Salt Lake City. For this workshop, the registration is closed, but you can go to the website, aoip.com, and you can find more information, the agenda, and there you're going to be able to see the recordings of the meeting and the reports. We have more than 300 people that are registered. We're going to have panels with updates on NASA Earth Science missions, and that would include CMS. We're going to have data tutorials, breakouts, talks, and one of those talks is going to be by Christopher Hiemstra from the U.S. Forest Service on mapping old growth forests in the U.S. and the role of remote sensing. That is very relevant to this talk. And with that, I would like now to formally introduce today's speaker, Dominic De La Sala. He's the chief scientist for World Heritage, and he is the former president of the Society for Conservation Biology in the North America section. As I mentioned, he's going to be talking about this initiative to map old growth forests. So without further ado, I leave you all with Dominic De La Sala.
Well, good day, everybody. Thank you for setting up this webinar today. And if we could just get the slides up on the screen, I've got a couple of acknowledgments to handle before we launch into the webinar. I'm a bit under weather today, so I have a non-COVID cold, and my voice might kick out at times, so you'll have to excuse the audible on this. And also, we have to play around with the next slide kind of thing in the talk because of the way it's set up today. But anyway, there have a lot of partners in this work that have been involved in a set of studies that we've been doing on mature and old growth forest that are pursuant to a couple of the president's executive orders. But I first want to thank NASA and the Forest Service because a lot of the data that you're going to see today are coming from their incredible monitoring programs, the JEDI sensor, the FIA plots. We couldn't do this work without that information. So it's so vital to the research community to have those tools available. And for many, many years, I've had on my professional bucket list a map, a basic map of mature and old growth forests of the United States. Why don't we have that? We live in one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world, and yet we don't have a simple map of mature and old growth forest for conservation purposes. And so when NASA released their JEDI sensor data from the LIDAR processing, naturally we jumped on it in a very thankful way. And you'll see on the slide here the we that have been involved in the set of studies. I think there's been 3 or 4 already published and several that are going to be going out in the next couple of months, continuing this work in the US and in Canada. So we're doing it North America wide. So just acknowledging my partners. The studies that we've been doing have been led by Dr. Brendan Mackey, who's an IPCC scientist, and his team at Griffith University, where we are jointly working on mapping and assessing the importance of primary forest around the planet. NatureServe has been involved with this, and so has the Woodwell Climate Research Center. So I want to thank all our partners and our funding source, One Earth, for a lot of what you're going to see today. And there have been multiple funding sources on this that have come to the plate since then. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn myself into a rocket scientist for the first time in my life, working with the NASA data sets. So we set out to do this right before the president issued these executive orders that you see on the screen now. So early on, around 2020 or so, got together with a bunch of folks from those partners and said, let's see if we can do this. And then since then, we've had a number of executive orders. When the president, Joe Biden, came into office, we got Executive Order 14008, which pertains to 30 by 30. That happened in 2021. And then last Earth Day, to the president's credit, and thankfully, he issued an inventory of the nation's mature and old growth forests, which was great because we had already done it. So it was good to see that it was now emerging on the federal side. And this is where we have the potential for a beautiful partnership. We've already turned over all the data sets that you see here to the Forest Service and to the BLM. And so there are pieces of those executive orders that I've highlighted in red that you're going to see in the talk today, particularly the inventory of what we'll just abbreviate as MOG, mature and old growth, on federal lands. And what does it mean in terms of things like the terms that are often turned around, like resilience and fire issues and climate smart management and conservation strategies. So we'll be talking a little bit about that. We also had a memo from Secretary Vilsack that also pertains to fire and forest, and I'll talk a bit about that as well. And then BLM, a couple of weeks ago, just issued national rulemaking for conservation and landscape health. And so this pertains to BLM lands, at least the forested component. Next slide, please. We hear a lot about nature-based solutions in the White House. When my team was in Montreal for the biodiversity COP15 meetings, released this a roadmap to nature-based solutions. And so what we're arguing is that ecosystems can provide about a third of the mitigation benefit for keeping the climate below overheating above what many think is really the critical threshold. And most of that, from a natural system approach, can come from the protection of primary forest and proforestation, which means growing forests back in places where they've been degraded and allow them to recover and recruit their carbon stock value. It's not just sequestration, but it's the stock in those forests that is absolutely critical as a climate mitigation strategy. That often gets overlooked. all of these other terms that you see, reduced impact logging, climate smart forestry, sustainability, etc., they may be improvements over industrial logging, but they're still at best delayed emissions. The only way to maintain stores is to allow those forests to mature and become old growth. Next slide. So the emphasis globally, as I mentioned early on with my team, has been on primary forest, but we really don't know how much primary forests were in the US before European colonization. So instead, we got this kind of back of the napkin map that the former chief of the Forest Service, Greeley, did in 1925. And everybody's seen this before, going from left to right, pre-European colonization through Greeley's time. You can see not much primary forest remains, something like less than 5% in the contiguous United States. Again, we really don't know what that was like. We can do some backcasting and look at potential vegetation and refine this a bit. But I don't think there's any argument that most of our primary forests were logged as the nation expanded westward over that period of time. So we don't really have much primary forest. So what we're really talking about is protecting the old growth and allowing the mature through proforestation to restore the old growth ecosystem. That's the concept that my team has been working on in our publications. Next slide. So, when you look at when does a forest really become a senior member of the community, I could say that now because I'm a senior member of my community. In terms of old growth, there's just no argument about what it is. I mean, we can call it different terms, and the regional Forest Service definitions are out there, but they're pretty old and they could use some updating, and they're not spatially explicit for the most part, at least currently. What it really comes down to is how do we get at mature? How do we define that? And foresters know what that is because the return on investment is when the growth in trees slows down. So we know what silvicultural maturation means, and we could look at it in terms of the cumulative mean annual increment of growth, and all foresters know what that is, or the culmination of net primary productivity, which Richard Birdsey and co-authors, including myself and Woodwell, published recently. And you can get a range of when those trees are culminating. And so that could be a definition of maturation. But there's also the structure-based definitions. And you could look at mature structures having all of those different elements that are present in older forest to a degree. And that degree determines, what you are going to qualify as mature. You could look at processes, and forests as they age develop all of those important ecosystem processes, whether they're above ground or below ground. We see that advancing as the age distribution increases in the forest. And then you've got advanced functions that occur as forests mature, buffering from climate, water regulation with the atmosphere, fire refugia, carbon stores are built up, and you get a basket of ecosystem services as the forests mature. Next slide. So prior to the work that you're going to see in the next series of slides, this is the only thing, the only published source that we have. It was pretty good. It was done by Pan et al. In 2006 using the incredibly important FIA plots to structure this age distribution across North America. You see the blue colors being the older age classes. It's incredibly important, very coarse level mapping, 1 kilometer resolution, not really what you would want to do a lot of planning on the ground when you're at 1 kilometer resolution and your plots are spaced at 6,000 acre intervals. And so what we wanted was a finer scale resolution so we could look at conservation target setting, 30 by 30, half earth, and 100%, all was something that we wanted to evaluate for mature forest on federal lands in terms of the trade-offs and the benefits. So that's what you're going to be seeing but at a much finer scale or resolution with updated data sets. Next slide. So really, this is the first of its kind attempt at putting together a national map in the contiguous United States for mature and old growth forest at the scale of 30 megapixels. And thankfully, again, we had access to the LiDAR data sets, and we were able to do a relative scoring based on the forest canopy cover, the forest canopy height, and the amount of above ground biomass in those 30 megapixels to come up with a sum of the scores that you're going to see in the next series of slides. And through that relative ranking, you can get a continuous distribution of structure developed classes from least structurally developed or young to most structurally developed or older. Next slide. Now, all our methods are in the paper that we published, but basically what we laid out was this ranking system for all these different forest type groups by ecoregion. So this is pretty massive data set. Each of those proxies, those structural proxies, were given a score and then a continuous distribution. And then for a validation step, we compared the overlap of FIA plots that we had with our mapped polygons to determine how good we were classifying with our model versus the forest metrics that were coming out of the FIA plot data. And that's what you're going to see in the next series of slides. So there was a validation step done in addition to using remote sensing. Next slide, please. So here's the first structural development map for the lower 48 states for forests. These are all the forest structure classes with the rankings. The bluer colors being the more structurally advanced forest. Next slide. So now you can just do all kinds of fun things with this. You can group it into these different structure classes. Young in the red colors, intermediate in the orange colors, and mature in the green. And we could do this region by region. We can cut it off in all kinds of different spatial patterns to get at where these forests occur in different regions at different scales of resolution. Next slide. And the validation step, as I mentioned, this is just one example from 41 different forest type groups that we did this validation step for. What we looked at was comparing what we were calling from our modeled structure classes, young, intermediate, mature, with what FIA was grouping as pole, mature, and late. And here's just two examples on the left of the screen there. On the left side of those scatter plots is the FIA classes of pole, mature, and late. On the right side are what we structurally modeled as young, intermediate, and mature. A lot of overlap. So we felt pretty good about our model classification system. You can see this if you want on the online supplemental in our publication. Again, it's a massive data set. There was a lot of validation that was happening. Next slide. Okay, so drum roll. Here's the first map of the lower 48 states just focused on the highest rankings for the three summed proxies, what we are calling mature and old growth. We grouped mature and old growth together. Further analysis, we could break that up into just mature and just old growth. But because there's so little old growth left in the lower 48, the conservation focus needs to be jointly on mature and old growth so that we can recover the ecosystem values. And in doing so, if the US were to take this step, it would comply with the Paris Climate Agreement about retaining sinks and reservoirs of carbon. Protecting the carbon reservoirs or stocks is vital to a forest-based mitigation approach, not just the sinks. Sequestration is important too, but the stored stocks that represent hundreds of years of accumulated carbon in the forest and the soils. Next slide. So now we can play all kinds of neat little games with this data set, including breaking out the MOG for every ecoregion, every forest type, every state, every landowner, and every gap status classification. And you can see the gap status in there. So they would do a conservation assessment on different targets. You need to know what these gap status codes mean. So one is wilderness and parks, two is national monuments, three multiple use, and four is converted uses. The tricky part is what to do with the roadless areas. USGS groups it as gap 3, but we felt that it required some level of acknowledgement. They're really important and they're protected from most development pressures, and so we gave them a gap status 2.5, and I'll explain that a little bit later on. We also overlaid all kinds of ecosystem service information we had. Thankfully, again, Forest Service drinking water data set. We had biomass carbon data sets. We had data sets from the NatureServe, red listed ecosystems and species. And you could look this up for every single landowner. We've got a website with all of our information and GIS shape files. Next slide. So this is what it looks like when you start doing the gap overlays by those different regions. So strictly protected areas, gap 1 and 2 versus gap 3 coverages you could see there for MOG. Next slide. And we could do it for the roadless areas. And with additional protections, the low-hanging fruit, roadless areas, can be moved into gap 2 status and bring the US closer to 30 by 30 targets. Next slide. We could break it out like this by landowner. You can see that on the x-axis, the percent of for MOG forest in the different gap codes on the y-axis. The horizontal lines you see there are the 30%, the 50%, and then the top is 100% target. And the green represent gap 1 and gap 2 coverages. So we've got a long ways to go, even to hit the bottom 30%. National forests come in at 23%. BLM MOG also comes in at 23%. Next slide. Here's what it looks like for every single national forest, green being protected. Again, only 23% of the national forest are in gap 1 and 2. Now, if you bumped up protections of the roadless areas, you would move that to 45% in national forests. So you would be close to the 50% target at that point if you had stronger protections for roadless areas. Next slide. On BLM, again, the horizontal bars there representing 30%, 50%, they also come in at 23% overall, but there's no roadless policy on BLM land. So you'd have to look at other mechanisms like the National Landscape Conservation System for bumping up protection of MOG on BLM lands, and that certainly will be in our comments as BLM solicits public comments on its rulemaking for conservation and landscape health. Next slide. Okay, so now you're going to look at some of the overlays of ecosystem services. And again, we had NatureServe's data set. They were a co-author on the papers that we did. So we have at-risk species, at-risk ecosystems, above-ground biomass, drinking water from the Forest Service data set. So we have a pretty good basket of ecosystem services to look at. If you protect MOG, you get a whole bunch of other important services that are critical in a climate mitigation strategy. Next slide. This is an overall map of NatureServe's, all of NatureServe's red listed categories. So what we did was we pulled out the MOG, red listed MOG types in the analyses that you're going to see, and we pulled out the red listed species that occur in MOG. Next slide. And so you get these kinds of distribution maps that we could do it by state. We got the two bars in there, 30% 50%. We've got the gap coverages, and this is for red listed ecosystems in MOG within and outside protected areas. And I don't expect you to kind of digest all of this, just kind of showing off the data set here and what could be done in an assessment of MOG values and why it's so important to protect MOG because of the red listed ecosystems that occur within it. Next slide. Same thing for red listed species. We've got it broken down by different categories of nature served listings that you see on the x-axis. And again, the horizontal bars, 30%, 50%, gap coverages for different species classifications. And the ones that we're most concerned about on the right-hand side of that distribution, the near threatened, the vulnerable, the endangered, and the critical. You can see how little is protected of the habitat that those at-risk species occur in that overlap with MOG. Next slide. And we've got it for drinking water. And I don't have time to go into all the drinking water layers other than to say we got a high overlap in MOG and the source areas for drinking water, especially headwater reaches. And I don't think that's a surprise to anyone that knows about Forest Service lands tend to have headwater reaches. And so where you've got that intersection of headwater streams, drinking water source areas, and MOG, you've got another benefit of protecting those forests in a radically changing climate. We need this drinking water, especially in drought-stricken regions, and MOG are often at the headwaters and the source areas of our downstream drinking water values. Next slide. Okay, so I'm getting to the wrap up on this in the context of the executive orders. So, just as a summation, only about 23% of the MOG is strictly protected on both national forest and BLM lands. So, we haven't even met the bottom, the lowest bound conservation target. Now, if IRAs were bumped up in protection, for example, withdrawing mining claims inside of IRAs, which is a principal threat still in many of these areas, you could get that to GAP 2 status, and then the national forest would be up to a 45% GAP 1, GAP 2 target for MOG. And what you would get is you would capture the carbon. So you'd have that built up storage that's been in those forests for decades to centuries. You would have clean water, endangered ecosystems, and at risk species. But you can't do it alone. You've got to also look at connectivity, other ecosystem types, what's going on in the surroundings, the land stressors that are happening at the landscape level. So 30% is a floor, not a ceiling, and it would have to be coupled with other conservation initiatives at the regional and national level. And what we concluded in our findings is that it is necessary to protect all the MOG on federal lands because of the values that you would be picking up. And so what's needed for that to happen is national rulemaking. And then that would comply with a lot of the US commitments on an international stage. And just kind of giving you a heads up that my team is now focused on Canada. We've started 3 provinces, forested provinces, published a lot of our studies already in British Columbia, and now we're in Ontario and Quebec and writing that work up, in addition to all of this that's happening in many, many countries around the world, led by our team in Griffith with the partnership with Woodwell. Also, we are in the process of conducting some emissions scenarios using the combination of studies that Birdsey et al. Did and I did together to do some emissions projections on what happens if you save all the MOG versus different logging scenarios. In my original paper, we said that if all the MOG were logged over a period of time, it would emit about 10% of US annual emissions. And so we wanted to kind of go a little further into that and look at different types of scenarios and emissions projections. So that's on our radar for the next paper that'll be coming out soon from our group. Next slide. I want to put in a bug here for the Tongass because it's a personal love affair that I've had since the early 90s when I was doing some of my original bird work on Tongass old growth and clear cuts. And so we've continued to do this work over decades. And back when I was a younger man, it was all about biodiversity. And now it's about carbon. And there's an intersection of the two. And so the study that we did with Woodwell came out also in 2022, and it quantified some additional values. And I don't have time to go into those plots other than to say that the colorful one is the distribution of carbon, with the lighter colors being the high carbon areas that also overlap with MOG. And the trajectories that you see there are different emission scenarios that we ran with historic logging, contemporary logging, and projected logging. And that's all in our paper. But the reason why I'm pointing out the Tongass is it really is a globally significant area. Still has 89% of its old growth, even though 3% of the largest trees are gone. There's still an enormous opportunity for conservation there while you still have an intact system. It has 16% of the nation's roadless areas on just 9% of the total national land base. It's potential climate refugia because of the moderating influence of the coastal climate. It won't heat up as much as the interior of Alaska, which is ground zero for climate change on the planet. And it has a tremendous carbon reservoir that is 20% of all the carbon in the national forest system. Most of that carbon is in the MOG and IRAs. So if you protect those areas, you're picking up most of that carbon. If you log those areas, you're emitting the equivalent of over 15 million vehicles based on those scenarios that I mentioned. So what we and others have been recommending is protecting all the MOG as industry now shifts into young growth. And that is a national model that could be for how all the federal forests uh, go about balancing MOG protections with other issues, including timber harvest. And the thing that's unique about the Tongass is nowhere else on the planet is a transitioning of the industry like this happening. This is globally rare. Normally, we see a transition when there's hardly any primary forest left. Example, New Zealand doesn't log primary forest anymore. New Zealand has very little primary forest left. So we don't want to get to a situation where the industry, the ecology, the climate are all pushed over the cliff. We've got to transition while the opportunity exists. Next slide. Okay, so I want to kind of go back to the executive order and this red highlighted language. There's some contradictory or conflicting goals in here, and I want to point them out in closing. So MOG is already fire refugia. And we see this in many different studies that mature forests tend to burn in lower fire intensities. So you already have your fire refugia, you already have your fire resilience. This is not a place you need to prioritize for treatment. The uncharacteristic fires are mostly in the industrial landscapes that experience fire under extreme fire weather. That combination is giving us the big fires we see today. That's where the restoration and the thinning and the fuels reduction should be prioritized. An example being the Northwest Forest Plan designated redundant late successional reserves, allowing for natural processes. And so far, recruitment rates of older forests into the reserves exceed the loss of those forests from fire. That could change under climate change, but right now it seems to be okay. So again, not a priority for fuels reduction. When old forests do burn, and they will at some point, that too doesn't appear to be a concern at this time. We looked at the largest data set ever assembled on the largest high severity burn patches in the 11 Western states. We found high rates of conifer recruitment inside the biggest high severity burn patches out to over 300 meters from the nearest unburned source. So there's your resilience. They will come back. However, the climate is shifting on them too, and it's something to be mindful about. So I think overall, the carbon storage, the basket of ecosystem services coming out of MOG should make them a priority for protection from logging and not for any kind of aggressive management in those stands. And any presumed benefit of thinning, and even if it's small trees, comes with substantial ecosystem and climate trade-offs. And it's relative, of course. If you're doing some light thinning from below the overstory, not a big deal. But if you're starting to take commercially valuable trees, the big trees, those impacts are going to scale up. Next slide. Okay, so here's my closing slide. So we've got Earth Day next week, and we are waiting on the announcement, the 1 year anniversary of the MOG inventory of Executive Order 14072. So what's needed here is national rulemaking that brings all of this together, that merges 30 by 30 with the inventory, with the White House's roadmap for nature-based solutions, with the Glasgow Forest Pledge, with the Paris Climate Agreement, and the president's goals on reducing emissions. We just published an essay about bringing all of this together in the journal Forest and Geoscience. And the billions of dollars of forestry work from the Infrastructure and Inflation Reduction Acts should go to surgically treat the most flammable logged areas first and foremost. There's plenty to do in those degraded landscapes where that money could be strategically applied in a way that has a restoration focus. In terms of climate smart management, which is mentioned in the EO, transitioning out of MOG logging is climate smart forestry. And that can happen on every single national forest and BLM lands. It's already happening on the Tongass, and it has been happening on the Siuslaw. Those are national models for how you could do it nationwide. Regarding resilience and climate adaptation, best way to get that is to protect your carbon stocks, because then you get everything else that comes with it. Biodiversity, the more biodiversity you have, the more adaptation possibilities you have from the level of gene pools to species and communities. Clean water and fire refugia all get rolled into that basket of services. And protecting MOG from logging is a step towards 30 by 30. However, we are currently aware of nearly 24 timber sales in older forest on national forest. And based on my published study, 50 million acres of MOG on federal lands are not inside protected areas. And if they were logged, you'd be dumping more emissions into the atmosphere in a climate emergency. I think the next slide is the very last one, which is just some of my citations and also the websites where you could download any of the data that you saw today from the studies that we've been conducting. And stay tuned because we have a couple of more papers that are going to be coming out of our partnerships with all the different research organizations involved in this. Again, thank you, NASA, and thank you to USDA for all the wonderful data sets that we've been able to use to bring you this information today that we hope is of value to all the stakeholders involved in putting together the mature and old growth inventory. So I'm going to turn it back over to our host.
Thank you so much, Dominic. Just in time, we will have like around 20 minutes for question and answers and discussion. So let me just stop sharing here. And we have a couple of questions already in the chat. I'm going to give also time for people who want to unmute themselves and make the questions and comments directly to Dominic. To do that just in a minute, but we'll go first to a couple of the questions that we have on the chat. Cherry Dysart, she has a couple of questions. Dominic, what does gap 2 at risk mean? And can we make the case that protecting MOG, the mature and old growth forest, will be critical to recovery of the salmon populations?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question, Sherry. Yeah, there's definitely an importance of protecting MOG, at least in the Pacific Northwest, as you know, with the late successional reserves and the Northwest Forest Plan, which did a number of things. It shifted increasingly timber management out of mature and old growth forest. That ecosystem is recovering. It still has a long ways to go. Only about 40% of, let me take that back, about 40% of the forest inside the reserve network are recovering clear cuts. And so there's much needed time to get those forests up to the point where they're starting to accrue their mature forest benefits in the reserve system. And we do know that via the Northwest Forest Plan, the region shifted from a source of emissions to a carbon sink, which is a huge climatic advantage. At the same time, aquatic conditions have been improving because of the aquatic conservation strategy. The more roads that can be pulled out of the system, the more culverts that can be improved for storm drainage, the better off the salmon are going to be. The more those forests mature, particularly in the riparian reserves, the better off salmon are going to be because that's the cool water that salmonids need, as you know, for their back and forth migration and their spawning. So it's absolutely been an important part of the recovering of the Northwest forest ecosystem through proforestation. So I really didn't get the first part of the question about the GAP level 2 status, but GAP 1 and GAP 2 are the highest degrees of protection that we've got in the National Forest System. It's not perfect, but it's better than GAP 3. And GAP 2 would be like national monuments, where there are more levels of activities that can happen in active management that can happen in them, where GAP 1 is wilderness and national parks. If we could get all of the MOG into GAP 1 and GAP 2, then we're going to be saving a lot of emissions, about 10% of the annual US emissions based on our estimate. We're going to be improving habitat conditions for all of those at-risk species and ecosystems, including salmonids. And we're going to get that basket of ecosystem services, which is so crucial in a planetary biodiversity and climate crisis. It's exactly what we need to be doing to lead by example internationally, given the president was one of 145 leaders that signed the Global Forest Glasgow Forest Pledge to end deforestation and forest degradation by 2030. You got to lead by example. Why aren't we doing that in the US right now?
Thank you, Dominic. Another question, this one from Junji Liu. What factors have caused an ecosystem being red listed?
Yeah, I wish the Nature Surf folks were on here, but I know that some of my colleagues, I see Jim Strithold is on here too. Uh, a number of us use the red listed ecosystem rankings on British Columbia's inland rainforest. And what we did is we looked at the distribution of all the species that we could get our hands on and the distribution of old forest in BC's inland temperate rainforest. We had some information on rates of logging. We had some information on population losses in a lot of those species, particularly caribou. And so we were able to apply the criteria for that whole ecoregion and rank it based on the number of criteria that are in the red listed status publications. And what we did with that is we essentially said that that was a critically endangered temperate rainforest because very little primary forest was left. Many of the species were in major decline, especially caribou, mostly from logging and a burgeoning human footprint. And we were able to track that human ecosystem footprint over 5 or 6 decades of logging and development in those ecosystems to go through the status criteria. Again, it goes from everything from common to critically endangered. And based on the criteria, particularly the footprint analysis and the rates of logging, that area came in as critically endangered. And so this is done by NatureServe. They do it for species, they do it for ecosystems using a whole suite of indicators.
Thank you, Dominic. We're going to use now some time for people that want to unmute themselves and make the questions or comments directly to Dominic. We have time for that. So if you want to raise your hand and I'll call on you, or right now, because we don't have any hands raised, you can just unmute yourself and do the question directly. So let's see if we have anyone. Nick.
Hi, thank you. I have a question about stand age class in the FIA data. Was that valuable? Is that useful to how you're considering MUG forests across the country? Is that data set useful to you?
Yeah, thank you. And everything in the FIA data set is just so valuable. And, we just use the break points for the class distribution, the poll to uh, to late successional, the way we looked at it, just to kind of do it on a very gross level. But I can tell you that the team that I'm working on, and I see Richard is on the calls here too, Dr. Birdsey, we're looking at pulling more of that information out right now. And Seth is also on the distribution here with Woodwell Climate Research folks. We're going to be teasing out more of that information where we have a good overlap between what we mapped in our polygons and what FIA has in their plots. So absolutely, H-class information is going to be important as we go forward to refine our mapping techniques. We'll be pulling more of that together. And age is really important. And, for rulemaking, we want a solid age class for what is mature. And I think what we're finding in our work is that the rate of carbon accumulation really takes off when forests get about 80 and above, or when their diameters are about 20 inches and above. And it varies from forest type to forest type. It's younger in places, it's older in places. But that's what we're looking at now. And if you just use carbon as your value that you get from an age and a DBH cutoff for mature, you're doing pretty good if you come in at about 80 or so as defining mature. And that also brings in the importance of proforestation. I could see Dr. Muma is in here too. And so I'm just borrowing from his publication on that, the importance of proforestation and allowing those forests that are at maturity to get into old growth, because you're building that carbon store that is in those forests over time. And that is really good for the climate, biodiversity, and all those ecosystem values. So yes, we will be pulling more information from that FIA data set. And thank you, USDA, for the ongoing work on that.
Dominic, having recognized me, I say thank you very much. I just might point out that in the IPCC working group 2 came out last year under natural solutions. They make the statement, it's also the case that protection of existing natural forest ecosystems is the highest priority for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and they cite our paper. So it's in 4 years, it's gone from invisible to more general acceptance. And work that we're doing here in the Northeast is very similar to what you're finding as well, which we started in the Pacific Northwest. But the Northeast forest, the same thing. And once they, it's not the case that the forests stop accumulating when they become mature. They actually accumulate more. And the other thing people don't recognize is that many species in hardwood forests have a natural life expectancy. Now it can be shortened by fires and everything else, but of maybe 300 or 400 years. It's true of even white pine, which ours are now up to about 200 years, and they're still packing on the carbon. So hardwoods like oaks, 300, 400, 500 years. Amazing enough, even a species like yellow birch, we've tapped yellow birch here that are 450 years old, and these are obviously just remnants. But imagine if more of those forests had been allowed to grow, what our carbon density would be.
Thank you, Bill and Dominic. We have a couple of people with the hand raised, so we're gonna go to them, and then we'll go, if there is time, to a couple of questions in the chat. So Teddy Wright.
Thank you for this opportunity. My question is in the chat, but I'll just read it.
Right.
Dr. De La Sala, why are the oceans not included as at-risk ecosystems which would benefit immensely from protecting MOG, especially the Northeast Pacific Ocean, which is of huge concern to me for protecting the southern resident killer whales, which are endangered, and most of our salmon population up here, which are either threatened or endangered. Stopping deforestation is germane to halting ocean acidification and warming. Thank you.
I couldn't have said that any better myself. You're right on the spot. I mean, it's all connected. All of these ecosystems are connected. The planet is one giant circulatory system, and so the emissions we put into the atmosphere, mostly from burning fossil fuels, but also contributing from agriculture, from forestry, are going to affect everything, including ocean acidification. So, yes, if we were able to protect all the world's primary forests, which represent about a third of the global total, we would definitely be able to slow runaway climate change down. And you saw that earlier slide about natural ecosystems can provide about a third of the mitigation benefit for keeping the planet from going above 1.5 degrees centigrade. And forests are the best terrestrial carbon sink and storage mechanism. So it would definitely be contributory to the overall global problem that we're dealing with. And if we don't do this, losing the ocean biodiversity would be a planetary collapse. The circulation of currents, the food that we get from the oceans, whether it's salmon or something else, are all at risk. So we've got to be tapping the brakes big time on our emissions load to the atmosphere. And by changing forestry to be climate smart, which begins by protecting the stocks and doing proforestation, we can have a major contribution in being able to come up with a comprehensive approach to climate mitigation.
Thank you, Dominic. Quickly to JJ.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much for your work. I so enjoy your programs. My Could you speak about we're up here in Washington trying very prodigiously to get the DNR to stop, these logging leases. And on that front, we often talk about increasing rotation of the logging. And yet I'm just sitting really uncomfortably with this idea that sort of prioritizes older trees then. In a sense, it gives us a short-term benefit of maybe, working out something else in the meantime if we can get them to increase the rotation from, say, 30 to 40 to 80. But that then means that aren't we then cutting down those trees later, those older trees, or it sort of gives this sense to the logging companies that yeah, it's okay to cut 80 to 100-year-old trees. So, what would you say about that, and how we should be framing this?
Yeah, and so anytime you take trees out of the forest, you're taking most of the carbon and putting it into the atmosphere. It's just the way it is. And carbon life cycle analysis accounting will show, particularly the work that Hudeberg and Associates have done and Bevlaw and Associates have done on life cycle analysis. There's a cost to the climate when you take carbon out of the forest. And the cost is greatest depending on how much carbon is in those trees, in the vegetation, and the soils. And so the best way to do this is just to protect the older trees. When you get it to be about 80 or so, that's when you're really getting the biggest carbon bang for your conservation buck. And so those trees really shouldn't be cut. If possible, they should be in a conservation agreement, set asides, legislation, whatever, policy, they shouldn't be cut from a climate and a biodiversity standpoint. Now, I would refer you to Bev Law's work in 2018. They did a study that looked at different ways to get at more carbon retention in forests. By far, the best way is to protect your stocks. And then you move into things like less aggressive logging, tree planting, afforestation. It all could be part of the mix, but the most beneficial means to do this would be to protect the stocks in the older forest. You can extend rotations. That certainly would get you a carbon benefit, but you're still going to be putting gross emissions into the atmosphere. And we don't have time for the net to compensate for the carbon debt by putting more carbon into the atmosphere during a global emergency. So that's why protecting the stocks is prime in terms of conservation strategies, and anything else that could be done to improve forestry is a benefit, but it's secondary to protecting the stocks.
Thank you. One more question from Junju Liu.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to ask questions. So my question is really about how the climate will the how the forest will change with climate change. So, and we know that I mean I am all for protecting the old forests, but at some stage there will be some degradation because of climate change. So it could become a source because the growth is much slower than the carbon release from the soil and from the other, even from the degradation of the forest itself. So my question is like, how to balance the old forest protection and possible forest degradation from climate change?
Wow, yeah, what a great question. And yeah, I spent a lot of time working with downscale climate models. And, I'm also a grandfather, and it worries me to see what the future is going to be if we continue on this emissions trajectory. Everything's going to change. Everything, every ecosystem. There are going to be winners and losers in all our ecosystems, and there's going to be a lot of loss. We're in a biodiversity crisis right now, and we're not heading in the right direction. So there are going to be ecosystem shifts. I guess the way I would address this is that nature will sort it out through adaptations. Genetic gene pools are the place where adaptations occur. The more variety that you have in an ecosystem, the more adaptation potential you have for being able to come up with mechanisms that allow older forest or biodiversity get through this bottleneck. I mean, we could do things like assisted migration and plant with different genome types, but we're really rolling the dice. The best mechanism we have is to maintain biodiversity because that's where the adaptation gene pools are going to come from. We're seeing this already with insect outbreaks, beetle epidemics. For example, the work that Diana Six has done has shown the survivors of beetle outbreaks have genetic resistance to those outbreaks. That's where the genomes are that are going to allow those forests to get through the outbreaks that are in turn being triggered by an overheating climate, which is allowing these beetles to really kind of continue to go through epizootic cycles where they're overwhelming forest and taking out a lot of trees. So I think there's so little we know about what this future is going to be like in these forests. They're going to be places that are going to look radically different. And there's going to be a lot of degradation unless we get off of this emissions trajectory and deal with the top-down drivers.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. One last question because we're at the top of the hour, so we just have time for one more question. We have Chris White from the Earth to Sky. Has this presentation been presented to U.S. Forest Service managers? And I will Dominic, you were presenting these data sets today. Like, what kind of like stakeholders or users you're expecting that these data sets can be useful for? So if you can comment a little bit on that, how do you expect the data sets to be used by?
Yeah, you bet. And again, thank you to NASA and thank you to USDA. It's your data. We manipulated it in terms of our analysis, but there's so much value in how the ability to see trees from space has advanced over the last decade alone. It's amazing what we could do with remote sensing now. I remember looking at Google Earth imagery one day. I saw my dad getting his mail in the mailbox from Google Earth. And so that's how good we're getting with this technology. And so what we've done is processed it in a form that anybody could use. And we've turned over all our data sets to USDA, made it available. I think there's an agreement that they have in place with NatureServe that's doing the data sharing. I'm hoping that they'll use it in their inventory. We still haven't seen what USDA is going to come out with and BLM on their inventory, but they've got access just like anybody else because all our publications are linked to those data sets that are posted online, even in raster file formats. So anybody could use it. We turned it over to conservation groups. They've been using it. So just contact me if you find that there's a use for this, particularly in forest planning. It's always good to, continue to refine it and get better, which is what we're doing with Richard Birdsee's team. But all of these data are publicly available and we're now in a position we've never been in before. We actually have a map-based assessment for the nation's mature and old growth forests. We've got the data, we've got the science. We just need the political will to be able to do something on a big scale, like what was done by President Clinton for the roadless rule in 2000. That opportunity is knocking on our door. I'm hoping that the White House will see that and provide additional direction to the Forest Service and the BLM to do something with these data in the form of national rulemaking.
Thank you, Dominic. Unfortunately, we don't have time for more. We are over the top of the hour, but people that want to follow up, they can follow up with Dominic. Hopefully, you have his contact information, or if not, you can send us an email and we'll contact or we'll put you in contact with Dominic. I want to reiterate again, as I mentioned in the beginning, we have a workshop that is coming in this initiative between NASA and the U.S. Forest Service in 1-2 weeks in Salt Lake City. And there we're going to have Chris Hiemstra from the U.S. Forest Service, and he's going to be giving a talk about the Old Growth Forest initiative from the side of government and important the role of remote sensing in this initiative. So you can follow us, as I mentioned, in our website, carbon.nasa.gov. We're going to post the recording, the slides that were presented today, and you can learn more about upcoming events, the efforts, and the projects that are being funded through this initiative of NASA. So thank you again to Dominic. Thank you for the time. Thank you for everyone that is joining. And, we'll be here next month with the continuation of the Policy Speaker Series. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.